nature is conducting all these experiments in how to be human, dozens of them, even in the last 100,000 years, maybe 6 kinds of humans or human-like creatures on the earth. And we're the only ones now. So what happened to them? Did we kill them off? Did they just die out naturally? Was it some combination of features? We really don't know. And that is one of the biggest mysteries of all. Why are we the last ones? And how much were we involved in the disappearance of those other species?
It's wonderful to have you back. We had a very interesting conversation last year. I guess it was in October, and it was all about that discovery of a million-year-old Chinese skull, right? That you made with your colleagues, and I'm gonna try and ask some questions about it later. But I always like to start my interviews by asking about people's origins. What inspired them to pursue their field, and or like what first sparked their interest in the work that they do. You spent more than half a century studying human evolution, right? And you're one of the world's leading scientists in this field. And a lot of people who follow your work, myself included, would love to know how far back does that fascination with human origins go? Maybe you were interested in these kinds of questions as a child, or how did you basically end up dedicating your entire life to this field?
Yeah, I mean, like many kids today, of course, I was fascinated with fossils, particularly dinosaurs. I was interested in astronomy too. I had a little telescope. So yeah, I was interested in science. So even at 5 or 6, I was interested, and my parents took me to the Natural History Museum. And yeah, it was great, of course, real fossils and the human fossils. And I was interested straight away, and people like the Neanderthals fascinated me. We had a school broadcast on the radio called How Things Began, which was all about Earth history. I remember there was a poster by the artist Maurice Wilson of a burial of a Neanderthal child. And it was based on Teshid Tash in Uzbekistan, where this child was buried, perhaps with the horns of goats around the burial. And there was a poster which came with the radio program. And I remember the program about this. They kind of reconstructed the burial with these Neanderthal wailing, mourning their lost child on this broadcast. So I remember that very vividly, and I must have been probably 9 years old, 10 years old. And I did a project on Neanderthals following that. I wish I still had it, but I was drawing Neanderthal skulls and reconstructions of them. My parents were a bit concerned drawing all these skulls all the time. They wondered if this was very healthy. But I didn't think then, of course, I would ever be working professionally on that kind of thing. It didn't seem possible. And when I went to do a degree, I was going to go to medical school. No one told me there was anthropology as a subject. The career advice was very limited. If you were doing science, then you maybe go in engineering, biological sciences, you become a doctor or a vet. So I had a place at medical school, London Hospital Medical School, and then at the last minute, really at the last minute, I found out about this subject called anthropology. And it seemed, obviously, it had human evolution and prehistory and genetics, social anthropology as well. And it really appealed to me. The breadth of it appealed to me. And somehow, I don't know, going down the track of being a doctor seemed very narrow compared with this interesting subject. But of course, career advice, certainly my teacher, my biology teacher said, you'll never get a job doing that. Stick to being a doctor. You will never get a job as an anthropologist. So it was a gamble. And of course, I got lucky in getting, when I finished my PhD in Bristol, I got the only job in the country that was around, which was to work at the Natural History Museum. The job came up just as I was finishing my PhD. So I applied for it and was given a research fellowship to begin with. So I was on trial for 3 years, and luckily they then turned it into a permanent position. So I went there in 1973. I'd already worked there in 1969 in a temporary job between my degree and my PhD. But in 1973, the end of 73, I got the position there, which started as a fellowship and then later on was a proper position. So yeah, and yeah, I've been there ever since, and it's obviously been a great place to work. Real fossils, Neanderthal fossils there, of course, Cabway Broken Hill fossil, the Tugun Neanderthal woman skeleton is there. So it's, you know, it was a great place to work, and obviously lots of recent skeletons as well for comparison. Primate collections, skeletons of chimpanzees, gorillas, and so on. So a great place to do work on human evolution research. And when I began, the techniques, of course, were very primitive to measure and study fossils. X-ray technology was very primitive. Measuring technology was very primitive. We had no conception of getting DNA from fossils. It didn't seem possible. Dating methods were, you know, we had radiocarbon dating already at that time, but it was quite limited in its reach, and it suffered from contamination problems. So often the dates were not accurate. So a lot of issues back in the 1970s and even 80s, which limited the field. But of course, things have moved on greatly now. So now we have CT scanning, we have three-dimensional capture of the shapes of fossils. And we have, of course, the recovery of DNA, and now beginning the recovery of fossil proteins, which can go even further back in time, because DNA is obviously limited in its survival. High temperatures and deep time are bad for DNA preservation. Fossil proteins survive better, so something like collagen can survive for millions of years at fossils. So people are now homing in on these materials and beginning to look at them. And that will become increasingly important in the future with some of the more ancient fossils where we're never going to have the DNA.
And so our first conversation, as I mentioned already, it focused on that million-year-old scholar, right? And it was like a very profound discovery in many ways. It was widely covered by the media, right, all around the world. You know, journalists, for like very good reasons, paid a lot of attention to it. Do scientists still look at the discovery the same way they did, you know, when it was first published, or they view this differently? And yeah, basically, where does it fit into our current picture, you know, of human evolution? And maybe it would be lovely if you could briefly remind us, you know, what was the discovery about and kind of why it was so significant.
Many years ago, fossils have been discovered at Yunxian in central China, and the dating suggested a date of around 1 million years for this deposit based on paleomagnetism, looking at the magnetic signal in the sediments and also the associated animal bones. They suggested a date around 1 million years, but the two fossil skulls that were then known from Yunxian had been squashed in the ground. They were distorted. The first one was very badly distorted. The second one, not so bad, but it had still been squashed flat. So this limited what people could say about them. Obviously, they seemed to have large brains, and they were assumed to belong to this species Homo erectus, which is a widespread species 1 million years ago. So my Chinese colleagues got to work using CT scanning in the last few years and used very sophisticated techniques to undistort the second skull, to raise it up, to separate the fragments virtually, and restore the skull to a symmetrical shape, to a much, you know, a more accurate shape. And 6 different reconstructions were done of how to reconstruct it, slightly different from each other. And we published what was the best one in our view as the basis of our study that was published in Science. And what we concluded was that Yunxian 2, which is the specimen we're talking about, it wasn't a Homo erectus, because some of the most characteristic features of erectus weren't on this fossil. First of all, the brain was very large. It was right, you know, at 1 million years, it has, on our estimate, the largest brain of any human, and much bigger than most erectus fossils. So first of all, the brain size is very large. Also, the shape of the skull was not typically erectus shape. So erectus skulls are usually quite angular. They're not well filled out. And at the back, they have a strong rigid bone across the back and an angled occipital bone. So Yunxian did not show those features. And it Also had a different face shape. The face was not so projecting outwards as in erectus. So in our view, it was not in erectus. Of course, we didn't know what species it was, but we could say it wasn't an erectus. It clearly wasn't a human. It wasn't a Neanderthal. It wasn't a heidelbergensis, because they also have some of this ridging on the back of the skull that we didn't find. Obviously, the next possibility was, how did it relate to other Chinese fossils? And we previously, 4 years earlier, published the skull from Harbin from northeastern China, about 150,000 years old. And that skull became known as Dragon Man, Homo longi, a distinct species. And that skull is pretty certainly the most complete example we've got of a Denisovan. So the Denisovans, to remind you, are a separate lineage of humans, initially established from DNA. So a cave in Siberia, in Russian Siberia. Russian archaeologists have been digging there for about 50 years. They found many fragments of bone and stone tools and very fragmentary fossils. But in 2010, a little piece of finger bone had such good DNA preservation that they were able to get a whole genome from work centered at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. And this whole genome was different from a Neanderthal one, different from a modern human one. So they became known as Denisovans, and our work suggested that the morphology of Harbin already was like other fossils that were thought to be Denisovans, including having a very large, there's only one tooth in the skull, very big molar tooth with splayed roots. That is also found in the Denisovan teeth. So we were pretty sure Harbin was a Denisovan, and then further work has confirmed that. So when we get back to Yunxian at 1 million years, this is obviously very much older than the Denisovan fossils and the Denisovan DNA. But on our analyses, it did seem to be an early member of that group. So my colleague Ziyong Ni led phylogenetic analyses, so using all the data, more than 500 traits of the skull, and even some other features on other fossils, and built a phylogeny using these more than 500 traits. And we got a series of clear groups. We got an erectus group, we got a heidelbergensis group, we got a Neanderthal group, we got a Homo sapiens group, and we got a group that had Homo longi in it, but also Yunxian seemed to be an early branch of that group. So in our view, at 1 million years, we've already got the separation of what became later on Homo longi and the Denisovans. And Homo antecessor, which is another species known from Spain at about 850,000 years ago, on our analyses, Homo antecessor also rooted in early to this Homo longi Denisovan branch. So that has big implications also for our evolution and Neanderthal evolution, because on our analyses and most genetic analyses too, obviously there's an early separation of Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo sapiens. If Yunxian at 1 million years is already showing the beginnings of the evolution of Homo longi and Denisovans, then that already was a separate branch 1 million years ago, which also then means that Homo sapiens must have been a separate branch then, and the Neanderthals must have been a separate branch. And Homo heidelbergensis have branched off even earlier, and Homo erectus even earlier than that. So it had implications also for our own evolution. So it pushes back the time of a common ancestor of us and the Neanderthals and Denisovans to at least 1 million years. So it was a big story. And of course, some people really didn't accept the results. They said, well, it is really an erectus. We're pretty sure our data shows it's not an erectus. We don't give it a species name. We're not sure what to call it. It's very different from Homo longi because, it's 800,000 years earlier than the Dragon Man skull. So it doesn't show a lot of those late features, but we think it's a very early member of that lineage. And since then, there's been new dating published of the site. And it's claimed now from dating analyses that the site is actually nearly 2 million years old. So about 1.8 million years for the Yunxian site. And this is based on isotope dating, and we don't think that's correct, basically. First of all, those new analyses were not taken from exactly where Yunxian 1 and 2 were found. They weren't able to access that exact place. So I think the site where the dating was done is at least 50 meters away from the original location where Yunxian 1 and 2 were found. So my Chinese colleagues certainly think that this dating may be from a higher river terrace, which is older. So the dates could be accurate, but in their view, it doesn't date Yunxian. And of course, if Yunxian 2 really was nearly 2 million years old, it's already remarkable at 1 million years with its brain size. If you put it back to nearly 2 million, you compare it with the fossils from, say, Denisovans, the brain size is double some of the Denisovan fossils. It's bigger than any other human fossil in the whole world, far bigger, if our brain size estimate is accurate. So it seems very unlikely to us. If you were to push that back to 2 million, it really changes everything about human evolution because it's so much more evolved than any of the other human fossils at 1.8 million. So we think the correct age is around 1 million.
I was curious, like, if you could pick maybe 2 or 3 mysteries now when it comes to human evolution that you would most like to see solved, right, during your lifetime.
Obviously, we'd like to have, first of all, for the Denisovans, we've got teeth and finger bones and some skulls. It would be great to have a whole skeleton of a Denisovan. You know, we've got pretty complete Neanderthal skeletons, Homo sapiens skeletons. We don't have the whole body of a Denisovan. There is a fossil skeleton from Yunxian in northern China, and on our analyses, that belongs to the same group as Homo longi. So in our view, it's a Homo longi and probably a Denisovan. Now that skeleton is less than 50% complete, but the pelvis, it's a woman's skeleton, and her pelvis is the widest in the whole fossil record. So she was very short and very wide, and she was living in northern China, not far from Harbin. Harbin is a huge skull. We think the Harbin individual is a male. Yunxian is a female. They're both very big, very bulky, and that's the kind of physique you need in very cold conditions. So we'd like to have a more complete skeleton of a northern Denisovan, like Harbin, but also we know from genetic data that the Denisovans were not just living in Denisova Cave and northern China. They were up on the Tibetan Plateau. They were probably in Laos, in Taiwan. And on genetic data from modern humans, modern interbreeding, so if you look where Denisovan DNA is found today, it seems that as our species spread across Southeast Asia, they met Denisovans and they interbred with them. And that event happened after 45,000 years ago, so quite recent. And that Denisovan DNA, if you look at it today, modern humans, the highest levels are found in the Philippines, in Papua New Guinea, in Australia, places like that. So that indicates pretty certainly that the Denisovans must also have been living close to those regions, which is where the interbreeding happened before they died out. And so the Denisovans were also down in the south in tropical and subtropical conditions. And almost certainly they would have looked very different from the ones in the north. And not only that, they are genetically different. So when we look at the DNA in modern humans that came from these ancient Denisovan interbreedings, it's not the same as the DNA from Denisova Cave. The calculation is that these southern Denisovans split probably 300,000 or 400,000 years from the Denisovans in Siberia. So the Denisovans were a very diverse group, more than Neanderthals, and also much more adapted to different environments. The Neanderthals were adapted to temperate and some cold conditions, but not severe cold. As far as we know, not high altitude. And as far as we know, Neanderthals were not adapted to tropics and subtropics. Denisovans covered all of those areas. So they're a really important group. And what we would love to have is a good fossil of a southern Denisovan, because it would look, I'm sure, quite different to ones like Dragonman. So that's another thing I'd love to see, a mystery of who were the southern Denisovans, what did they look like? When we look back at Neanderthals, we've got quite a lot of fossil material. We've now got a lot of DNA from Neanderthals. And clearly there was interbreeding between us and Neanderthals as well, which is why people outside of Africa have around 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. But also that means that that interbreeding, which happened maybe 45,000, 50,000 years ago, there must be some hybrids there. First generation hybrid, a child that had maybe a Neanderthal mother and a Homo sapiens father. It would be incredible to find the evidence of that. It's there somewhere. Maybe some fragmentary fossils already are actually hybrids, and maybe DNA work will show that. But it will be great to find, and they will turn up. They are there somewhere, and it's only a matter of time before we have real hybrids of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. From Denisova cave, as you probably know, there's a tiny fragment of bone, which is a hybrid of a Neanderthal and a Denisovan. So there was a girl who lived maybe 60 or 70,000 years ago in Denisova cave, and her mother was a Neanderthal and her father was a Denisovan. Now, unfortunately, that's only a tiny fragment. So again, it would be great to have a skeleton of a Neanderthal Denisovan. So that's another thing that it would be really important to have. And then there are these mysteries of these dwarf species. So we have the mysterious hobbit living on the island of Flores, a dwarf species, an ape-sized brain, found there until probably living there at least until 50,000 years ago. Very small-bodied, and recent evidence suggests quite simple culture. There's some new analyses that suggest this was not an active hunter of dwarf elephant-like creatures called stegodons lived on the island. It was thought that these hobbits were living off the stegodons, but recent taphonomic analyses of bones in the cave where they were found suggest that actually the so-called Komodo dragons were actually killing the stegodon, and these hobbits were scavenging bones, not hunting the stegodon. They're getting second access to the bones. So probably quite a simple technology, a simple way of life to go with that smaller brain, but surviving there until 50,000 years ago, and probably arriving on the island more than 1 million years ago. There are some fragmentary fossils at 700,000. There are stone tools at 1 million years that suggest that there was some human-like creature there more than 1 million years ago. So where did they come from? Their whole history is unknown to us before that time. So another great mystery to be solved is the origin of hobbits. And also, similarly on the Philippines, even more fragmentary remains of something called Homo luzonensis from Luzon in the Philippines. And there you've got just some small teeth, again, small-bodied individual, but the hand and foot bones look very primitive. They look like those of hominins from more than 2 million years ago, something that was probably still climbing in the trees some of the time. And that was living on the Philippines 100,000 years ago. So again, where did that come from? What's its early evolutionary history? Completely unknown to us. Homo naledi, another one, this strange species down in South Africa. About 300,000 years ago, this creature was living in at least one cave in South Africa. It must have been in many more, of course. But from there, Lee Berger and his colleagues have recovered dozens of partial skeletons of this Homo naledi. And it's another small-brain creature that was there and seems to have had a long separate evolution. It's called human, Homo naledi, but some of us wonder whether it really is even a human. It could be a parallel evolution in South Africa of something that looks human, but could have a completely separate ancestry because it shows a very strange mixture of human-like features and much more primitive features, including the small brain cells. And again, huge arguments about its behavior, because Lee Berger and colleagues have claimed that Homo naledi was burying its dead deep in the cave. Perhaps from proteomic data, only females were being buried down there. They were taking the bodies deep in the cave and burying them. They were also engraving the cave walls. They were building hearths and fireplaces down there. A lot of us are very cautious about that data. I'm certainly very cautious. But it's such a fantastic species, such a puzzling species. So really, we need to know where that came from and what happened to it too, because at that date, 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens and Homo heidelbergensis were around in Africa. The survival of luzonensis in Philippines and floresiensis in Flores can be put down to isolation. Those creatures got to those islands very early, and then they were left alone for 1 million years or more and evolved in their own separate ways without competition from another human. But Homo naledi, at 300,000 years, is in Africa where there are already bigger-brained humans around. So how did it survive? What was its way of life that kept it separate? And what happened to it? So, yeah, that's just a few of the mysteries. And, the biggest mystery of all, of course, why we're the last ones left. So nature is conducting all these experiments in how to be human, dozens of them, even in the last 100,000 years, maybe 6 kinds of humans or human-like creatures on the earth. And we're the only ones now. So what happened to them? Did we kill them off? Did they just die out naturally? Was it some combination of features? We really don't know. And that is one of the biggest mysteries of all. Why are we the last ones? And how much were we involved in the disappearance of those other species?
I'm happy that you mentioned this Denisovans a few times, because it was such an extraordinary discovery. It happened not too long ago, yeah. And I guess it was very surprising to scientists for several reasons. You've had a long and very productive, obviously, and hugely successful career in science. And what would you say has been the most surprising discovery in the field of human evolution, during your lifetime? Would it be the Denisovans or maybe something else?
Yeah, there have been so many. For a single find that is really revolutionary and puzzling, I mean, Homo floresiensis really has to be one of them. One of the most surprising, because first of all, we didn't think that ancient humans had even got to Flores. We thought that only Homo sapiens was a species that had got that far towards Australia on these chain of islands, because Flores has never been connected to larger land masses, either east or west. So it was never connected to Java. It was never connected to Australia through a chain of islands. Even when the sea level fluctuated and when the ice caps were large, the sea level fell sometimes 125 meters. But Flores was never joined on to those bigger land masses. So it was always isolated with deep water, and you'd have to have a boat, it was thought, to get there. So it was thought only Homo sapiens could get there. And then suddenly this strange creature turns up, published in 2004. It's on Flores, and people think, well, it has to be a Homo sapiens, and yet it's got a brain the size of a chimpanzee's brain, and it's only 1 meter tall. So it's really astonishing that this weird creature, first of all, got there. And I'm one of the people who doesn't think it got there on boats. I think it got there by natural rafting. And that may seem extraordinary, that creatures can travel a long distance to a distant island, but this is a process that happens in nature. Many creatures have arrived on islands in the Pacific, for example, on natural rafts of vegetation. And even with that tsunami from 20 years ago, massive tsunami, in Southeast Asia, people were found at sea 150 kilometers from where they started, still alive a week later on rafts of vegetation, surviving. Now that's in the last 20 years, when you've got hundreds and thousands and even millions of years of time. This is a very tectonically active area. Tsunamis are a regular occurrence with volcanoes and earthquakes happening. And I think that most likely it arrived on Flores from somewhere like Sulawesi to the north, not from Java to the west. And it came there, maybe not even in one go, maybe from one island to another. To say, when you've got hundreds of thousands of years, a rare event becomes more likely. And so I think they got there by rafting. Maybe Homo luzonensis, the same thing happened on the Philippines. So, yeah, it's a hugely surprising find. Of course, the initial analyses suggested it was only 20,000 years old, which was even more amazing because Homo sapiens had clearly been around in the area before 20,000 years. So how had it survived so late? We now know that dating is in error, and actually the last remains of floresiensis, the stone tools, at least go to 50,000, and after that you've got Homo sapiens at the site. So we think that floresiensis, maybe it's lasted till 45,000, but we don't have the last record of it. But it went on that long, and then its ancestors, as I say, seem to have been on the island 1 million years ago. So it's an extraordinary story of long-distance survival. And you have to feel sorry for it. It's been there, it's survived there under all these conditions of changes and for 1 million years or more. And then, it disappears very quickly. And it's sad, that a species like that could apparently be so long-lived and successful and then goes under. It's a shame we never saw it. We have its bones, but maybe it's better for floresiensis that it had gone, because I'm not sure how we would treat floresiensis if they were still around today. Would we put them in cages like chimpanzees and gorillas?
What's amazing to me is that the deeper we look, the more kind of similarities we find, right, between us and and other human species. And I guess that's what makes it so difficult to answer that question that you posed, like why we're the only ones left, because we used to mention that we have all sorts of abilities that other human species didn't really have. But that's not really the case now, right? Like Neanderthals were also extremely smart, right?
I mean, 20 years ago, I would have told you that any interbreeding between us and Neanderthals would be very limited. I accepted it could happen because closely related mammal species I knew 20 years ago they could interbreed, like polar bears and brown bears, and jackals and wolves. But I thought it was not normal behavior. It would be rare. And it happened 40,000 years ago. We'd never find evidence of it today. And also, I was wrong about that, because in 2010, the Neanderthal genome, high-quality genome, was reconstructed and showed that we did have Neanderthal DNA today. So that was a surprise. But I think that, it's kind of the way science progresses, that we think we have an answer, and then obviously things get more complicated, and for the behavior too. 20 years ago, I would have told you that we were vastly superior to Neanderthals. We were painting caves and they didn't do it. We were wearing jewelry and they didn't do that. We had complex technology, they didn't have that. We probably had complex language and they could maybe only had the simple language. I always thought they could speak to each other, but I doubted they had anything like the complexity of languages we have. Now, all of that is now in doubt. We found so much evidence of Neanderthal complexity in their behavior. They certainly seem to be marking cave walls. Okay, they weren't painting, as far as animals or making little figurines, which Homo sapiens did, but they were marking cave walls with lines and markings. And they certainly were manufacturing jewelry of some kind, animal teeth, perhaps the talons of birds of prey, the claws of birds of prey being worn as jewelry, collecting nice shells and using them as exchange items and maybe to make jewelry. So that kind of behavior is in Neanderthals. And the most astonishing example, of course, is these deep structures in Bruniquel Cave. So a cave in southern France. Explorers broke into this cave, went deep into this cave in the dark zone, and they found these two oval structures made of broken stalagmites. And it wasn't known how old it was to begin with. It was assumed it was modern humans that had done it. But when the structures were dated using uranium series dating, they were produced about 176,000 years ago. And as far as we know, in southern France, it was only Neanderthals there 176,000 years ago. So what it means is that some Neanderthals, and it had to be a decent-sized group, had got down there into the deep cave, 300 meters into this cave, where it's completely dark. They must have taken fuel with them and fire with them. And they then set to work. They spread out. They went to distant parts of the cave, found stalagmites, broke them to a set size, brought them back to this place, and built these two oval structures of the stalagmites, dry stone walls. And we don't know why. We don't know why they did it, because the center of these structures has still not been excavated. It's covered in stalagmite itself. And so French scientists are being very careful about disturbing it. And obviously we don't know whether some people think it's a ritual structure. Maybe they were worshipping cave bears and they built these shrines down there. I think they might well have been living down there. It seems incredible, but of course this was a cold stage and it would have been actually warmer down in the cave. There was also a river at that time running close by where these structures are. where they would have had fresh water. And in the winter, there were a number of hibernating cave bears, which could have provided food. So it may seem incredible. They would have had to have fuel, of course, so the fuel supply for lighting for a start. And they were burning animal bones, which are high in fat, some of them, to make light. So we really don't know. But what it does show more than anything is the complexity of their behavior, the fact that they could be organized enough to prepare for that trip deep in the cave, to stay down there for at least several days to do that work. And how could they do that without complex language? I mean, they must have been communicating to plan that and to do it and coordinate it. So, yeah, so that makes me think Neanderthals have got complex behavior and probably complex language. So that then makes the mystery of our survival and why they didn't survive even stronger. There was a view that genetically, in their last few thousand years, they were very low in diversity, very low in numbers. They were inbreeding and building up bad mutations, if you like, in their gene pool, which are harmful because close relatives were being forced to breed with each other. There is some evidence of that from sites, for example, in Siberia and Spain. But there's a recent publication of data from France and Belgium that the last Neanderthals there, maybe 45, 50,000 years ago, were still quite diverse. They were not breeding with close relatives. They were not as badly off genetically. So that seems a less likely reason for their disappearance. But I do think that competition with Homo sapiens must be a factor. That obviously within, let's say, 5,000 years of an overlap with Homo sapiens in Western Europe, the Neanderthals disappeared in Western Europe. We don't know where they were last of all. Maybe they survived in further east longer, but in Western Europe, they seem to be gone by 40,000 years ago. And that disappearance seems to coincide with the spread of Homo sapiens in their territories. So I think there was economic competition. These populations are going to be hunting the same animals, collecting the same plant resources, wanting to live in the best places. And so I think the groups would have been, maybe not in conflict, but at least having to share those environments. And resources, of course, were also not constant because this was a time of great climatic fluctuation. The climate regularly changed from nearly as warm as today to bitterly cold and back again, sometimes in a few centuries. And so food supplies would have also been fluctuating. So the population that could adapt more quickly, that could survive in those situations, would be the one that gets through. And eventually it was us. So I think there was an economic competition. But I've explained about the Denisovans over in the Far East, that they were very widespread in a range of different environments. They were probably genetically more diverse than the Neanderthals, and yet they also disappeared. We don't know the timescale for that. They seem to have been at Denisova Cave until about 45,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens is there, becomes present at the cave. But further south I mentioned Ireland, Southeast Asia, if they were down there, on some estimates, they were down there until maybe 30,000 years ago. So they could have survived a lot longer further south, but they also disappeared. So we know nothing about that story, what caused their disappearance. And obviously, again, Homo sapiens spreads in the region, but it looks like Denisovans did not go quickly. They survived further south for a longer period of time. Much longer period of time, it seems, in some places. So that's a story that we really know very little about. The book covers really the whole story of human evolution. Although it focuses on the later part of the story, I do go through the earlier part as well, the beginnings of the human line and divergence from our closest living relative, the chimpanzees. So I look at these claimed early hominins, things like Sahelanthropus and Orerin and Ardipithecus. So these creatures are thought to be very early on our line after we separated from the chimpanzee lineage. But it's not really clear that they are hominins. It's believed that some of them at least walk upright. But certainly in my review, I'm quite cautious about accepting them as being the earliest hominins. I'm not sure it's clear. But then we come on to the Australopithecines, so-called southern apes, and those are much better known, far more skeletons, far more remains from East Africa, from Southern Africa, also even from what's now Sahara Desert. And so these were a very widespread, very diverse group of hominins. They certainly walked upright. So they clearly are more closely related to us than are the chimpanzees and gorillas. So they're on the human lineage, but they're not fully human. They have small brains. Their body shape and behavior in many ways is still ape-like. They're still spending time in the trees, as well as walking up on the ground. So I talk about them, and there's a lot of species to talk about. And then, of course, the origin of humans. In my view, human equates with genus Homo. People use the term differently. So for some people, we're the only humans. And then you need a name even for Neanderthals, because they're not human. Well, I disagree with that. I think if you're genus Homo, that means you're human. So I call Neanderthals human, Denisovans are human, Heidelbergensis, Erectus, they're all human. Interestingly, I discussed the possibility that luzonensis and floresiensis and naledi are not truly human. In my view, they diverged earlier, and they're parallel evolutions of human-like features. So I bring that up, and that's quite controversial, of course, in the book. Maybe they're not even really human, which then shows the power of evolution, that it can evolve human-like features in parallel in completely separate lineages. So that's a good story. And then, because I come on to us and Denisovans and Neanderthals, which is the main part of the book, we discuss those three groups, what we know about their evolution, what we know about their interactions, a little bit about what their behavior. I'm not an archaeologist, so talk a bit about their behavior. And then, of course, that whole issue of what happened to them, and the fact that we've got this continuing mystery of explaining, and I have got my own solutions to that. But when my editor gets those chapters back, I'm going to be working on that last chapter some more, because even that paper now about Neanderthal genetic diversity changes some of the things I've said in my last chapter. So I'll need to come back to that.
I'm sure you know Alice Roberts, right? Also from the UK. And have you had maybe some sort of collaboration with her?
She's filmed me on TV programs talking about human evolution and visiting sites we were working on. So we found early evidence of humans, very early evidence in Britain of people up in East Anglia, living near the coast, stone tools that were 900,000 years old. And so, yes, she's filmed me talking about that, visiting the sites. And also I've helped advise on some of her TV programs, checking facts and scripts and supplying sometimes replica fossils for her to show. So yeah, we know each other quite well. And she does great outreach for science and has done for many years.
Okay, one of the last questions, because I don't want to take too much of your time. There's been a lot of talk that human evolution might come to an end, meaning that because of modern medicine, right, and because of this technological civilization that we've developed, no longer have to face the evolutionary pressures that our ancestors faced, right, tens of or hundreds of thousands of years ago, and we can treat diseases, we live much longer, right, and our lives generally are far more comfortable than the lives of our ancestors. I think you would agree that evolution is happening all the time. As long as we're a biological species, and we haven't yet merged with AI or anything like this. Made me think about what might be the future of human evolution. It's very hard, obviously, to predict it with any certainty. There are so many factors to take into account, but you can give your own speculation about this. How you look at, because obviously we have to deal with climate change, and this will inevitably affect the way our bodies and brains perhaps evolve. And
first of all, on the ongoing evolution, yeah, I agree with you entirely. Of course, each of us has, I don't know, on some calculators, 50 mutations compared with our parents. So our genes are changing through time, and evolution really is about differential survival. And today, in any society, some people have more children than others. So that is going to change the gene pool. And diseases are still selecting us, of course. They're not all going to be cured. And it's true to say that, yes, we take away a lot of the problems our ancestors had in living a natural life, if you think, having to hunt and gather, face dangerous wild animals and all of those things. Well, we don't have that, but selection is still working on us. And there are still many people in the world who don't have good medical care, who don't have enough water and food. And they're still being very dramatically affected, who don't have the right climate protection. And so evolution is shaping us all the time. It's still shaping us. And with COVID, for example, obviously that changed the gene pools of populations across the whole world. And interestingly, Neanderthal DNA, we didn't talk about it, but we know that some bits of Neanderthal DNA were giving protection against COVID, and other bits were making people more vulnerable to COVID. So that kind of selection also is going on, changing the frequency of bits of even Neanderthal DNA in our genome. But for the future, evolution doesn't have a forward look. It's about what works now. And so predicting it is pretty difficult. And I think you mentioned climate change, and for me, that is going to be the most severe thing. We're having a heat wave in Britain, a third one now in a short time, and it's still only July. So these are very severe conditions. People are dying because of those conditions, excess deaths, undoubtedly. And when you look at the future for humanity, if we don't do something serious about it, we're going to see even more profound changes, because there will be obviously much less stable conditions, not only high temperature, far more tempestuous weather, unpredictable weather, forest fires, typhoons, hurricanes, huge rise in sea level. When the Greenland ice cap melts and then parts of Antarctica melt, we're going to have huge sea level rises. So I'm very pessimistic if we don't really get a grip on the climate change situation, at least try and stabilize it. We can't get rid of the existing CO2 situation. We've probably got to live in a planet already now that's 1 or 2 degrees warmer. But in order for it not to get worse than that, we've got to move very quickly. And if we don't, I can envisage a time, an awful time, when we would have no one living in the tropics and subtropics of the whole Earth. It will be uninhabitable because of high temperature and lack of drinking water. And everyone left will be living near the North Pole or the South Pole, on whatever land there is that's available. And it will be a much smaller number of people, because you couldn't sustain that population size we have today in a small area of the North and South Poles. So that's a very pessimistic view of how bad it could get. And then you've got to look for long-term evolution. Who's going to survive in that situation beyond that time? And I have no answers to that. But all I can hope is that common sense will prevail. Humans will realize, and that includes the top politicians, that we really have to address this, because it's already very serious and it's only going to get worse if we don't address it properly. Sorry to end on a bad note like that, but it is serious, very serious.
But it's also interesting, like if we go back to previous periods, in our past, a lot of these big transformations in life, they were caused, right, by dramatic climate change. Yeah. So it's also a good lesson for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Many extinctions in the past due to major climate changes and CO2 changes, of course. Yeah, levels of carbon dioxide causing dramatic changes, and then huge numbers of species dying out. And that's certainly what we're beginning to see now.